The woman Gideon pulled from the fire should not have been there at all. Not in that place. Not in that form. Some things are meant to stay hidden, and some rescues change the shape of a man's life. Before he even realizes what he's done, she stood nearly 7 feet tall, her frame wide enough to make grown men look small, almost unfinished beside her. Yet when she lifted her eyes to him, Gideon saw something he had never seen in someone so powerful. Not anger, not defiance, absolute terror. When he asked her name, she gave him nothing. When he asked where she came from, she turned away. But when the old Apache man arrived at his ranch the following morning, Gideon understood the truth. Pulling her from the flames had been the easy part. The fire had started just after sunset. Gideon noticed the smoke first, rising in a thick column from the valley near the edge of Apache territory, a stretch of land he had learned to avoid during his 15 years of solitary ranching. It wasn't fear that kept him away, exactly, but respect for boundaries and an understanding that nothing good came from trespassing where you didn't belong. Still, something about the way the flames climbed into the darkening sky made his hands move before his mind caught up. He saddled his horse without thinking, told himself it was habit, told himself it was instinct, the reflex of a man who had seen enough death to recognize its shape. When it came calling again, the cabin was small, barely holding itself together even before the fire took it. The roof sagged inward, the walls already blackened and cracking. Through the collapsed doorway, Gideon saw movement, someone trapped beneath a fallen beam. He didn't hesitate. He never did when it came to moments like this. The heat scorched his face the instant he crossed the threshold, smoke tearing into his lungs like poison, his eyes watered, vision blurring, boots crunching over burning debris. What he found inside stopped him cold. The person pinned beneath the beam wasn't thrashing or screaming. She lay perfectly still, watching the flames crawl closer with a calm that looked almost like acceptance. That alone would have been unsettling, but it was her size that stole Gideon's breath. She was massive, not heavy, not misshapen, but built with a strength that looked carved rather than grown. Even trapped, even motionless, her body radiated power. Her arms, pinned beneath the beam, carried muscle that could have snapped a man's neck without effort. For a moment, Gideon wondered if he had walked into something he didn't understand, something he wasn't meant to interfere with. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were dark, deep as canyon shadows, and in them he saw something that decided everything. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of living. That look, that exact flavor of resignation was one he recognized. He had seen it in his own reflection for years. Gideon grabbed the beam. It didn't budge. The woman's eyes widened, slightly, the first real emotion she had shown, but she still didn't speak. She only watched him strain against something that would have taken 3 men to lift. He shifted his grip, planted his feet, and pulled with everything he had. The wood groaned. His shoulders burned. Something inside him, something long dormant, roared awake. The beam shifted inches, then a foot. The woman rolled free just as the roof began to give way. Gideon didn't remember how they got outside. One moment they were inside an inferno. The next they were sprawled on the ground 30 feet away, coughing, gasping for air that didn't burn. Behind them, the cabin collapsed in on itself with a sound like bones breaking. She sat up slowly, deliberately. For the first time, Gideon saw her fully. She was extraordinary. Her height, her breadth, everything about her seemed designed to inspire awe or fear. Probably both. He extended his hand to help her up. She stared at it as if he had offered her a weapon. That was when he noticed her hands. Dozens of old scars crossed her palms and fingers, precise and deliberate. These weren't the marks of labor or accident. They were the scars of intent. She didn't take his hand. She rose on her own, unsteady but refusing help. When she stood to her full height, Gideon had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes. She studied him in silence, then turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing between the trees like smoke. Gideon stood there until the fire burned itself into nothing, wondering what he had just saved, and more importantly, what he had saved her from. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, that look of surrender, the scarred hands, the way she had chosen death over accepting help. When dawn came and he heard horses approaching his ranch, Gideon already knew his life was about to change. He just didn't know how impossible that change would be. The old Apache man dismounted with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. 3 younger men flanked him, faces neutral, hands never far from their weapons. The old man's eyes found Gideon immediately, sharp and assessing. He spoke in English, the accent thick but the words precise. "You saved my daughter last night." It wasn't a question. Gideon nodded. The man's expression didn't change. "Then you must marry her." Gideon's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. The morning sun stretched long shadows across the porch. But everything suddenly felt cold. The old man stood perfectly still, waiting. Behind him, the younger men shifted slightly, practiced and ready. Marry her, as if pulling someone from a fire. Automatically created a debt, payable only with a lifetime. Gideon set the cup down carefully, buying himself seconds while his mind raced through responses that died before reaching his mouth. This wasn't something he could laugh off. The old man's eyes held more than gratitude. "I don't understand," Gideon said finally. "My name is Taza," the man replied. "The woman you saved is Nalnish, my only child." Something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps. "Among my people, a life debt must be honored. But there is more than tradition here." Gideon waited. Taza's next words came slower. "Nalnish cannot return to our village. She will be harmed if she does. Perhaps killed." He said it like a simple fact. "You risked your life for her without fear. This makes you worthy." Worthy of what? Of protecting her. Of giving her a place where she can exist without persecution. Taza stepped closer. "I ask you to give her what I cannot. Safety." The word lingered. Gideon thought of his 15 years alone, the careful isolation he had built. He thought of the woman from the fire. "Why me?" he asked. "Because my own people are the danger." "What did she do?" "She was born." Taza's urgency sharpened. "If you refuse, I understand. But she will be dead within the week." He set a leather pouch on the railing. "You have until sunset. She waits by the creek east of your pasture." They rode away, leaving Gideon with a choice that made yesterday's fire seem simple. He walked to the creek without deciding to. Nalnish sat on a rock, tense, watchful. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and deep. "He should have let me burn." Gideon told her what Taza had asked. She laughed bitterly. "A curse," she said. She showed him her scars, told him about the ceremonies, the isolation, the fire, about the men who wanted her gone, about fear dressed up as righteousness. When riders appeared, Gideon stepped in front of her without thinking. 5 warriors, hunters. Nalnish rose to her full height and spoke with authority that made them hesitate. She told them she would not die quietly. When Taza arrived with reinforcements, the threat retreated, but not the danger. Later, when she told Gideon about the man she killed in self-defense, the fear made sense. When she saved the child trapped beneath the wagon, and the mother recoiled in terror, Gideon understood what kind of life she had been sentenced to. When the woman fled toward the settlement, Gideon knew the choice had already been made. "I'm deciding now," he said as the sun lowered. Taza returned. The ceremony was rushed, hands joined. A binding spoken. Nalnish became his wife with the sound of approaching horses in the distance. When the settlers came with weapons and hatred, Gideon stood between them and said the word that changed everything. Family. And when the dust settled and the marshal rode away, Gideon felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Relief. The dust from the settlers' horses had barely settled, when the weight of what had just happened began to press in on Gideon from all sides. The ranch, which had always felt quiet and empty in a way he had chosen, now felt exposed like a place marked on a map for trouble. Nalnish stood beside him, her posture straight, her face composed, but Gideon could see the tension still coiled in her shoulders. Fear didn't leave her easily. It never had. It simply waited. Taza lingered only long enough to make certain the settlers were truly gone. When he finally mounted his horse, his movements were heavy, burdened by something that went beyond age. He looked at Gideon with an expression that held gratitude, regret and warning all at once. "What you have taken on will not be easy," he said. "My people will not forget." "Nor will the settlers," Gideon nodded. He already understood. "I know," he replied. Taza turned to his daughter. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the old man reached out and rested his forehead briefly against hers. A gesture so intimate and restrained it struck Gideon harder than any display of emotion could have. "You are bound now," Taza said softly. "Do not come back. Do not send word. Live." Nalnish inclined her head once. When Taza rode away, he did not look back. The silence that followed was different from the quiet Gideon was used to. It wasn't empty. It was heavy with unsaid things. Gideon cleared his throat. "We should go inside," he said, "before someone else gets ideas." Nalnish nodded and followed him into the house, ducking slightly beneath the doorframe. Gideon noticed the way she moved through the space with care, as if afraid of breaking something simply by existing. Inside, the house felt smaller than it ever had. Gideon had lived in it for 15 years, but now, with another presence filling the room, every wall and corner seemed closer. Nalnish stood near the table, hands folded, eyes scanning the space with a quiet wariness. She didn't sit until Gideon gestured to a chair. Even then, she perched on its edge, as if ready to leave at the first sign of rejection. "We don't have much time," Gideon said. "That woman will talk. The settlers will come back eventually, with or without law on their side." Nalnish nodded. "They always do." Her voice carried no bitterness, just certainty. "We should leave," Gideon continued. "West, further than most people care to travel." "How soon?" she asked. 3 days, Gideon said after a moment's thought. "Enough to sell what I can, pack what matters." Nalnish absorbed that, eyes drifting around the room. "You're giving up a lot," she said quietly. He shook his head. "I gave it up years ago. I just didn't know it yet." That night they slept under the same roof as husband and wife, though not together. Gideon took the narrow bed in his room. Nalnish settled on a pallet near the hearth, refusing the bed without explanation. Gideon didn't press. He lay awake listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of another person, breathing in the dark. It felt strange. Not unpleasant, just strange. The next morning, Gideon rode out early. He sold his cattle to a neighboring rancher, who asked questions. Gideon did not answer. He traded tools he couldn't carry for supplies he could. By noon, word had already begun to spread. People looked at him differently, some with curiosity, some with suspicion, some with outright fear. Gideon felt none of it as sharply as he would have once. Something in him had shifted. When he returned, Nalnish was splitting wood behind the house. Gideon stopped short, watching her lift the axe with practiced ease. Each swing was precise, controlled, as if she were constantly aware of her own strength and careful not to let it run away from her. She noticed him watching and paused. "I didn't want to sit idle," she said. "That's fine," Gideon replied. "Just don't break the stump." The corner of her mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. They worked side by side the rest of the day, speaking only when necessary. It was an easy silence, built on mutual understanding rather than awkwardness. Gideon noticed the way Nalnish always positioned herself slightly apart, as if expecting to be told she was too close. He made a point of not stepping away. That night, over a simple meal, Nalnish finally spoke again. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said. "You made the binding to stop the mob. Once we leave, you could go your way. I could go mine." Gideon looked at her steadily. "That's not how it works," he said. "Not for me." She studied him, searching for mockery or pity. Finding neither unsettled her more than either would have. "Why?" she asked. "Because I don't walk away from commitments," Gideon replied. "Even the ones I didn't plan for." The second day passed in a blur of preparation. Nalnish packed with efficiency born of years of having little. Gideon realized she owned almost nothing. No personal objects, no keepsakes. Nothing that tied her to a place or time. It made his chest ache in a way he couldn't quite name. That evening, as they rested near the fire, Nalnish spoke again. "You know they'll follow," she said. "Not immediately, but someday. Then we'll keep moving," Gideon said. "Or we'll stand." "You're not afraid?" "I am," he admitted. "But I've been afraid for 15 years. Fear didn't save me then." She considered that, then nodded once. They left at dawn on the third day. Gideon didn't look back at the ranch. He didn't need to. Nalnish did. She paused at the edge of the clearing, gazing at the house that had briefly been a place of safety and danger all at once. Then she turned away and mounted her horse. The journey west was long and quiet. They traveled through open plains and narrow passes, sleeping beneath the stars when they could, sheltering in shallow valleys when storms rolled through. Gideon learned quickly that Nalnish was an excellent rider despite her size. She handled a horse with gentleness and confidence, speaking to the animal in low tones that calmed it. One evening, as they made camp near a riverbank, Gideon asked, "Do you regret it?" Nalnish looked up from the fire. Regret what? Choosing this, he said. Choosing me. She thought for a long time. I regret that it had to be a choice at all, she said finally. But no, I don't regret surviving. As the days turned into weeks, Gideon began to see Nalnish not as the figure pulled from the fire, not as the woman feared by two worlds, but as a person shaped by endurance. She laughed rarely, but when she did it was quiet and surprising. She listened more than she spoke. She carried herself with a dignity that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with survival. One afternoon, they encountered a small group of travelers heading east. The men stiffened when they saw Nalnish. Hands drifted toward weapons. Gideon stepped forward before words could be spoken. Passing through, he said calmly. The men watched Nalnish with open suspicion, but they let the pair pass without incident. When they were out of sight, Nalnish exhaled slowly. That never stops, she said. I know, Gideon replied, but it doesn't have to define us. She didn't answer, but she walked a little closer to him after that. They reached the valley the marshal had mentioned, just as autumn began to settle into the land. It was remote, quiet, and beautiful in a stark, unassuming way. Water ran clear through the center. The surrounding hills offered shelter from harsh winds. Gideon dismounted and surveyed the land. This could work, he said. Nalnish nodded. It feels empty, she said, in a good way. They built the cabin together. Gideon cut and fitted the logs. Nalnish lifted and set them with careful precision. The work was hard, but it was honest. Each day left them exhausted and sore, but it also left something behind that neither of them had felt in years. Purpose. At night, they ate together by the fire. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance between them lessened. Nalnish began to take the bed some nights. Gideon didn't comment. He simply made room. Winter came early and harsh. Snow cut them off from the world for weeks at a time. Gideon worried about Nalnish, about how isolation might affect her after everything she had endured. Instead, he watched her thrive in the quiet. She chopped wood, hunted when necessary, and learned the rhythms of the land with an instinct that surprised him. One night, during a storm that rattled the cabin walls, Nalnish spoke in the darkness. You lost your family, she said softly. Gideon didn't answer immediately. He hadn't spoken of it in years. Yes, he said at last. I'm sorry, she said. I know what it's like to be the reason people disappear. He turned toward her. You weren't the reason, he said. Fear was. She absorbed that in silence. By spring, the valley began to change. Green pushed through the earth. Birds returned. Gideon found himself watching Nalnish work the soil, her hands gentle despite their strength. He realized then that something had shifted again. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. They didn't speak of love. They didn't need to. What they built was quieter and, in some ways, stronger. Trust, respect. The knowledge that neither of them stood alone anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, Nalnish stood beside Gideon and said, If they come for us again, I won't run. Gideon nodded. Neither will I. And in that shared certainty, forged by fire and fear and impossible choices, their partnership settled into something real, something lasting. The first sign that the past had finally found them came not with gunfire or shouting, but with absence. Gideon noticed it at dawn. The valley, usually alive with small sounds, the rustle of birds, the distant movement of deer, felt muted, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Nalnish sensed it too. She stood at the cabin door, scanning the tree line with a stillness that made Gideon's spine tighten. Someone's been here, she said. Gideon followed her gaze. Near the creek, one of their traps lay sprung and empty. The ground around it bore footprints that were not theirs. Heavy boots, several men, recent. He exhaled slowly. They're careful, he said. Didn't want us to know right away. Nalnish's jaw set. They want us uneasy. It worked, Gideon replied. They didn't panic. Panic had never helped either of them before. Instead, they prepared. Gideon checked the rifle, counted ammunition. Nalnish packed essentials into a small satchel without being asked. It struck Gideon then how instinctive their coordination had become. No discussion, no debate, just understanding. By midday, they saw smoke rising from the far ridge. That's not a campfire, Gideon muttered. Nalnish shook her head. Signal smoke. They want to be seen now. They waited until dusk before moving. The hills gave them cover and the wind favored silence. As they crept closer, voices drifted through the trees, low, confident, careless in the way men become when they believe they hold the advantage. Said she'd be with him, one voice muttered. Big as a damn ox, another laughed. Doesn't matter. He bleeds same as anyone. Gideon felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, resolve. They watched from the shadows. 5 men armed, not settlers passing through. These were hunters, the kind that followed rumors and coin. Nalnish leaned close, her voice barely a breath. They'll come at first light. Gideon nodded. Then they won't leave. She studied him, searching for hesitation. Finding none, she placed her hand briefly over his. It was not a plea. It was acknowledgement. When dawn came, it came hard and fast. The men approached the cabin openly this time, spreading out just enough to feel clever. Gideon stepped into view before they could surround the place. Rifle held low but ready. That's far enough, he called. They stopped, surprised but not deterred. One man stepped forward, hat tipped low, smile thin. You Gideon Cross? Gideon didn't answer. The man's gaze slid past him, landing on Nalnish standing in the doorway. The smile widened. Heard you had something that didn't belong to you. Nalnish's voice carried across the clearing, calm and steady. I belong to myself. The man chuckled. That's so? Folks back east say otherwise. Gideon raised the rifle a fraction. You can turn around and walk away. That's your only mercy. Silence stretched. Then the man sighed. Shame. The first shot missed Gideon's head by inches. Everything after that moved too fast for thought. Gideon fired, dropping one man before the echo faded. Nalnish was already moving, her strength unleashed not in rage but precision. She disarmed one attacker with brutal efficiency, sent another sprawling with a blow that knocked the breath from him. The fight was short, violent, final. When it ended, 2 men lay dead. The others fled into the trees, fear finally outweighing greed. Gideon stood shaking, rifle still raised. Nalnish wiped blood from her forearm, her expression unreadable. They'll tell others, she said. I know, Gideon replied. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Gideon looked at her fully, not as someone he had sworn to protect, but as someone who stood with him equal in danger and choice. We don't have to stay, he said quietly. We can move again. Nalnish looked at the cabin, the valley, the land they had shaped together. Then she met his eyes. No, she said. This time we don't run. That night they buried the dead far from the cabin. Gideon said no prayers. Nalnish marked no graves. Survival didn't allow for ceremony. As they sat by the fire afterward, exhaustion pulling at their bones, Gideon finally spoke the thought that had been growing for months. They'll keep coming, he said. Not all at once, but eventually. Nalnish nodded. Then let them come knowing what waits for them. She rested her head against his shoulder, not tentative, not unsure, just there. For the first time since the fire that had changed both their lives, Gideon understood something clearly. This wasn't borrowed time. This was defended ground, and whatever came next would have to face them together. Spring did not arrive gently. It came with rain that turned the valley's paths to mud and storms that pressed hard against the cabin walls, as if the land itself were testing whether Gideon and Nalnish truly meant to stay. They did. Each morning they rose with the light. Each night they barred the door not in fear but in readiness. Word spread as it always did. It arrived in pieces first, whispers carried by passing trappers, half-spoken warnings from traders who lingered too long before moving on. Gideon listened without asking questions. Nalnish heard what went unsaid. People knew where they were now, and they knew the cost of coming too close. The next group came weeks later. They were fewer than the last, but smarter. They did not announce themselves. They watched from the hills for 2 days, studying patterns, counting steps, measuring silence. Gideon sensed them on the second night, the way a man senses a storm before the sky darkens. They're waiting, he said quietly. Nalnish nodded. So are we. Confrontation came at dusk. No speeches, no threats, just movement in the trees, and the sharp understanding that this would decide something final. The fight was brutal and close. Gideon took a knife to the shoulder and kept standing. Nalnish was struck hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. But she rose again, eyes clear, strength unwavering. When it ended, the survivors fled without looking back. This time they did not return. Summer settled over the valley like a held breath finally released. The land softened. The creek ran full and steady. Crops took hold. Slowly, the tension that had lived in Gideon's chest for years began to loosen. Nalnish noticed before he did. "You don't wake reaching for the rifle anymore," she said one morning. He considered that. "Neither do you." They shared a quiet smile, one earned, not hopeful. People began to pass through again, cautiously at first. Some stayed a night. Some traded. Some left gifts without explanation. No one asked questions. No one pushed boundaries. The valley developed a reputation spoken of carefully with respect. A place guarded not by law but by resolve. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the hills, Nalnish stood watching the land they had defended and shaped together. "All my life," she said, "people decided what I was before they knew my name." Gideon joined her. "And now?" She met his eyes. "Now they decide whether it's worth crossing this valley." He huffed a quiet laugh. "Seems fair." The seasons turned. Years passed. They never held a ceremony, never spoke vows. They didn't need them. What bound them had been forged in fire, sealed by choice and proven through survival. Love, when it came, arrived not like lightning but like stone laid carefully upon stone. Strong, enduring, unmovable. One winter night, long after the dangers had faded into memory, Nalnish spoke as they lay listening to the wind outside. "If the world had been kinder," she said softly, "we might never have met." Gideon turned toward her in the dark. "Then it wouldn't be this world." She smiled, unseen but felt. The valley stood quiet beneath the stars, no longer empty, no longer afraid. And in that place, once claimed by fear and blood, two lives finally stood rooted, unbroken, and free.